This week on Inside Olympia, is the Northwest heading for a lights out event? A new report sounds the alarm about electricity supply outstripping demand and sooner than we thought. On the program, Arne Olson of the consulting firm Energy and Environmental Economics.
From the TVW studio, it's Inside Olympia with host Austin Jenkins.
Welcome to Inside Olympia. We take it for granted that when we flip the switch, the lights will come on. But demand for electricity in the Northwest is growing and supply is not keeping up. A new report by an independent consultant delivers a stark warning. The region faces a growing risk of power supply interruptions, and not a decade from now, but starting this year, with the need for major new sources of energy needed by 2030. The problem? Bringing new energy sources online takes years, and the region is not on track to meet the growing demands for electricity. How dire is the situation? What are the potential solutions? And how much will it cost? Joining me now, and for the full hour this week, is Arne Olson, a senior partner with the national consulting firm Energy and Environmental Economics, which produced the report on behalf of a coalition of utilities and power producers in the Pacific Northwest. Welcome to Inside Olympia. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
You made the trip all the way from San Francisco.
Yes,
I appreciate that. So we've been talking for a number of years in this state about two things. One, decarbonizing, moving to clean energy, getting off of coal, natural gas, and at the same time about growing power demands, electricity demands, especially as we electrify our system or our usage more and more. You bring those two things together and it seems like we're kind of on a collision path. And my sense was it was looming, but maybe not imminent. And it feels like a big takeaway from this report is that this is now on our doorstep. And we face some pretty potentially serious concerns in the short term. So what would you say is the top line takeaway when you sit down with your clients, which are these utilities, if you have an opportunity to talk to the Department of Commerce and the Office of Energy, what would you be saying to them?
Oh, well, I think you teed it up well in your introduction, that we see a looming shortfall of electric power with the need to construct a significant amount of new resources to fill that gap. And as you said, the need is now. It's not 10 years from now. So there's a lot of action that needs to happen in order to develop those resources and ensure that we can have a reliable electric system.
I think that the stat that jumped out at me that I want to visit with you because it just seems so shocking is that we are on track in a few years from now to be at a sort of deficit that is the equivalent of peak load in the entire state of Oregon.
Yeah, very roughly. That was how we tried to contextualize what that number meant. The number is 9,000 megawatts, and that's very roughly the amount of energy that the state of Oregon consumes. Now, it's important to place that into context. The entire system today is on the order of, let's say, 40,000 megawatts. So there's, that's the size. It includes, the region that we studied includes Idaho and Montana and Utah and Wyoming and Washington and Oregon as well. So it's a larger region than just Washington and Oregon. But yeah, that is an indicator of how much load growth we're seeing, growth in electric demand we're seeing in the region. And with retirements of existing resources, that leads to a gap that needs to be filled.
Let's talk about the short-term risk. And I'm very curious if we are at risk right now, as we speak, of this region experiencing rolling blackouts or an actual deficit where the demand exceeds capacity. I believe the report talks about a particular scenario where we have a very low water year and then a very long cold snap in the winter when everybody's boosting their heat demands. But help us understand the scenario where we might be at a breaking point and then what would happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the first thing to understand is that there's always some risk of a power supply shortfall. Even in a system that's perfectly well planned, all the resources are developed exactly in time with electric loads. No utility plans to have zero blackouts anytime, anywhere. And the reason is that would just be incredibly expensive to do that. So the standard that is typically used in the industry, and which is we applied for our study of the Northwest, is what we call 1 day in 10 years. So once every 10 years, you're allowed to have a power supply shortfall, which hopefully is small, and hopefully it isn't lengthy, so it minimizes the disruption. But that's roughly the standard that we plan to. So there's always some risk of what we call a power supply shortfall. Our study found that the region's system today just about meets that industry standard of once every 10 years. So next year, there might be, let's say, a 10% chance that there would be one event during that year, very roughly. What we find is that over the next 5 years, again, as electric demand grows and as existing resources are retired, and there are very few resources in the development pipeline that will come online during that period, that's why that deficit grows, and the risk of this type of an event grows and is increasingly likely as you move forward in time.
And can you walk us through that wintertime scenario? Some people might think, oh, the biggest risk would be summertime when, if we have a heat wave, more and more people are getting air conditioners. Of course, we're not the South. Not everybody has them. But the inverse scenario was included in the study, which was this wintertime scenario.
Yeah, and this is something that just varies depending on the region, depending on the electricity system, depending on the characteristics of both the electric demand and the resources that are available to serve it. So as you know, in the Southwest, of course, they have the highest demand in summertime due to air conditioning. The Northwest has highest electricity demand in the wintertime, and that's largely, not entirely, but largely due to the use of electricity for space heating homes and businesses. The Northwest has another unique feature, which is this role of hydropower in our region. So hydropower provides something like, depending on how you measure it, 60 to 65% of all the energy that we use. The hydropower system is a tremendous asset for the region. It's a lot of very low-cost energy. It's very flexible in its dispatch. It does have this
and it's
issue,
carbon-free.
And it's carbon-free. Yes, exactly. It does have this feature, this issue that the amount of energy that you get from the system depends on the year, and it depends on the hydrology of the year. In a very wet year, we have a lot of energy coming out of the hydro system. In a dry year, we have a lot less energy coming out of the hydro system. So for the Northwest, it's really that combination of an extended winter cold snap, Arctic air mass that moves in, it sits over the region for several days, and if that occurs during a year in which we have very low hydro conditions, that's when we would have the highest risk of a energy supply shortfall event.
And if that happened, how would it manifest?
Yeah, so if there were a supply shortfall, utilities would engage in what's called rotating blackouts. So that means that they would go block by block, and this block would be turned off for an hour or two, and then it would be turned back on, and the next block would be turned off for an hour or two, and it would be turned back on. And you go through that process until the demand on the system subsides enough or supply comes back online, and now you have enough supply that you don't have to do that anymore. The nature of that event, again, can really depend on whether it's a wintertime, whether it's summertime, whether it's hydro that's partly causing it, or other resources. The biggest concern we have, and the biggest event that is driving a lot of our results, is if it's a very dry year and you have an extended event, you might have an energy shortfall that lasts for several days in a row. And again, that doesn't mean that all the lights go out for several days. It means that you have to continue rotating block by block for several days in a row.
Obviously, there's an interest in avoiding that scenario, and there's kind of the short term and the long term, and I know that that's how you and your team sort of looked at this. But let's just step back and ask the question, how did we get here, and why is this electricity crisis seemingly looming much more quickly than maybe we had anticipated or at least hoped? What are the driving factors that you're seeing?
Yeah, I think there are a few. One of them is that the region has just been a little bit behind in terms of the resource development pipeline.
Have we been resting on our hydroelectric laurels for too long?
There may be a bit of that, but I think it's probably more that the region hasn't seen a lot of growth in a lot of years. So it's been relatively flat in terms of electricity demand. Our economies has grown, our population has grown, but our electricity consumption hasn't really grown very much over the past 20 years. Also,
and would that be because we've found some efficiencies and we've been able to leverage those?
Certainly, that's one reason, yes. My flat screen TV only uses, 5 or 10 watts, which is kind of astounding relative to an old cathode ray tube. It's also because of the change of the region's economic base. So all of the aluminum smelters have shut down, for example, and a lot of that has been replaced by Amazon and Microsoft and the types of, knowledge-based industries that create a lot of value without a lot of industrial processes, let's say.
Okay, so we've been able to sort of get by for a period of time. Even though we're a growing region population-wise, we've been able to kind of moderate our demand, growth demands. So, but now something's happening. What's shifting? What are you seeing?
Yeah, so again, a couple things. One of them is the climate laws that have been passed in Washington and Oregon now require development of a lot of new resources and new resources of specific types. And resources that don't emit carbon, so wind power, solar power, geothermal, for example.
The states have said we need to decarbonize. We're going to move away from coal.
Yes.
We're going to move away from natural gas. We got to find carbon neutral ways to power our future.
Yes, and those laws were passed in this decade, which is, let's say, maybe a little bit later than some of the other states. And that's significant because there's been some changes in the industry in this decade, which are meaningful for the ability to develop power plants. It really started during the pandemic, which disrupted supply chains for just all kinds of products all over the country and really all over the world. Was very disruptive for the electric power sector, with a lot of our products coming from China and the Far East. Then the federal policy has been very harmful to power development activities as well since the new administration came into office. So the Inflation Reduction Act, which was passed in the Biden era, was intended to help overcome some of those supply chain challenges that we had seen emerging during COVID, and that was the hope that it was going to be able to do that. That went away very quickly when the new administration came into place.
Was that because of their pivot back to prioritizing oil and gas and fossil fuels?
Yes. To me, it really feels a lot more like prioritizing moving away from anything that they perceive as being, woke or the other side. Wind and solar are disfavored by the current administration, which is different from previous Republican administrations. We should understand that the Bush administration, Republican administrations throughout the West have historically been fairly pro-renewable power, because that's more power to power their economies. It's economic development in their communities. So the new administration was a very sharp 180-degree pivot away from, had really been a bipartisan policy in favoring renewable energy development for a long period of time.
And it's not as if red states haven't been building wind and solar for many years. But to be clear, how is that policy shift? If we've been already, I just want to go back to our region, if we've been slow to move anyway, how does that policy shift fit into this creating kind of the crisis, if you will?
Yeah, so if you look at what's in the plans that Northwest Utilities put out, they're called Integrated Resource Plans, or IRPs, there are a lot of resources in those plans that were scheduled to come online between 2026 and 2030. And those are resources that are needed with all the analysis that they've done to meet electricity demands, but then also to meet the policy goals that the states have passed and put upon them. And even then, the amount of power that was scheduled to come online during those 5 years was 3 to 5 times more than the region had ever been able to develop in a similar period in the past. So just the pent-up demand sort of caught up with the region. We're trying to do a lot in a very short period of time, at a time when it's harder to do anything. It's harder to develop new plants than it's been in a very long time. Again, for a variety of reasons, supply chains, federal policy, not just the Inflation Reduction Act, but the federal government is using its levers of power in terms of permitting any federal action that's required to advance renewable energy projects. And there are a lot of federal actions by all of the various agencies required. Those are all being slow-rolled. Secretary Bergen of the Interior put out an edict last year that any federal action that had to do with wind power in the Department of Interior had to come up through his office, and he had to personally sign off. This is the kind of thing that we're seeing. So that's all combining to make it very, very difficult for the industry to develop clean power plants at this particular point in time.
There are also some state level and region level bottlenecks. And by the way, we should mention that the Bonneville Power Administration is responsible for about 3/4 of our energy supply in this region, and then investor-owned and public utilities account for the remainder. One of the challenges, as I understand it, is plugging in new sources of electricity to the BPA system, but we've also got strict environmental laws on the books in our Northwest states, at least Washington and Oregon. We have hurdles to siting new facilities. We have a lot of opposition from local communities, from tribes and others. So you've helped us understand how change in federal policy is adding some challenges. What about our own regional and state policies?
Yeah, and you hit on a couple of the things that are important to bring up. So one of them is siting and permitting. So finding a good place to put a wind farm or a solar plant is, let's say, more difficult in Washington in particular than in other states.
Like Texas.
Like Texas or even California. California has a lot of very sunny land that nobody lives on. It's really a vast amount of desert in California. Washington is a relatively small state and highly populated. And so the number of acceptable sites is going to be fewer than in other Western states where there's a lot more open spaces. Oregon's a little bit better in that way. Wind generation also is only located in particular places where the wind blows. In the Northwest, that tends to be along the Columbia Gorge, where there's a kind of a wind tunnel effect, whereas there's more wind in places like Montana and Wyoming that are on the eastern slopes of the Rockies. So just finding sites to build wind and solar plants in Washington, Oregon is challenging. Getting those permitted through the state agencies and local agencies, counties, is also challenging, takes time. And then you mentioned the role of Bonneville, the Bonneville Power Administration, in operating the region's transmission system and connecting these resources so that the energy can be delivered where it's needed.
I've read that this can sometimes take more than a decade to get approval from them.
I mean, there's a notorious project that is under construction now that has been in the works for 19 years. And this isn't to point the finger at Bonneville. They're doing a lot with, again, what's a challenging situation for them to retain their staff with what's happening in the current administration. But generally, the transmission interconnections have been slow. The transmission development has been slow. And so, yeah, those are other reasons why we now find ourselves in this position.
We've also been, and I want to go, you've hinted at this a couple times or referenced it, we are taking supply offline. We're closing coal plants. We're not going to get coal power from Montana anymore. Even natural gas is disfavored right now. So bring that piece into the equation.
Yeah, so all of those things combined. Yes, there are several power plants. The Centralia plant here in Washington, which closed down in 2 phases. There's the Boardman plant in Oregon, shut down in 2020. There's a plant in Nevada called Valmy. There's the Colstrip plant in Montana, which Washington utilities, including Puget Sound Energy and Avista, have derived power from for many years. These are all being closed. These are large plants. So they need to be replaced with equivalent resources, and that's just really, again, adding to the challenge. Not to say that can't be done, it certainly can. It just adds to the magnitude of the build that's required.
Okay, let's look at the other side of the ledger. What is driving growth in electricity and energy demand in the Northwest faster than maybe we had anticipated?
Yeah, so then you take all of that, and I think it's
and
good
that's the supply side.
That was the supply side and all the challenges of developing. And you add on top of that now what we're seeing across the country as an unprecedented amount of new electric demand, largely but not entirely from the tech industry, data centers, largely driven by artificial intelligence and the demand for large language model training. It's not just that. There's a lot of other sort of onshoring of manufacturing that began during the Biden administration, and some of which is still continuing. So there's other sort of large manufacturing facilities that are looking to locate domestically, but a large part of it is data centers. That's in the near term. Over the longer term, we see policy-driven growth due to electrification, electric vehicles coming online in large numbers, and there are state policies to incentivize the procurement of electric sources of heating, electric heat pumps, so that people can stop burning gas in their homes.
So a lot of what you have described are policy-based decisions and that are driving our sort of energy footprint, if you will. how much of this, whether you agree or disagree with decarbonization as a public policy, how much of this deficit we're facing between our demand for electricity and our supply is self-inflicted, and how much of it is because of things that are sort of out of our control, like growth in population or growth in use of electricity?
I mean, I wouldn't call it self-inflicted. I think Washington and Oregon are following a playbook that other states have followed ahead of them, including California. The new wind and solar resources can be developed, and they can become an important and reliable part of a power portfolio. And so it's not irresponsible to plan to shut down coal plants that are already many decades old and which are emitting large amounts of not only carbon dioxide pollution, but also harmful other criteria pollutants that affect the health of residents in the areas around those plants. And so the idea isn't the wrong idea. It's the right idea. It's what we need to do. It's just that the circumstances in which we're trying to now make this transformation of our power system have become much more difficult than they were when the bills were passed, let's say 4 or 5 years ago.
I want to make the transition to what the solutions might look like, but before we do that, what is your primary message to the utilities that retained your firm, to policymakers? What is the urgency of that message?
I think the message is the urgency. As I said, the utilities have been planning to build plans. They just need to get that done. We need to build a lot of stuff as quickly as we can, knowing that whatever we try to build, only a fraction of that's going to actually get done. It's very difficult to do. So it's sort of full speed ahead, pedal to the metal, whatever metaphor you want to use on getting steel in the ground now. It also includes doing what we can, everything that we can, to harvest resources on the demand side as well. So we need to be going out into our communities and putting in place load flexibility programs, flexible electric vehicle charging programs, virtual power plants, demand response. Some of that stuff can be brought online faster than large, industrial scale power plants. So we need to be doing that as well. It's really all of that needs to be done very, very quickly so that we can solve this near-term problem. And then from there, we need to pivot and focus on what the long-term investment plan needs to be to meet our both reliability and affordability and environmental goals over the next 20 to 30 years.
And if we don't do that, if we don't figure out how to blow through some of the bottlenecks and speed up the pace of development of the variety and array of solutions that you've laid on the table, what happens?
Well, as we discussed earlier, there's always some risk of rotating blackouts. The utilities do everything that they can to avoid those, including emergency actions. There may be emergency imports of power from neighbors. There may be things that can be done on the river that might increase mortality to fish, but would decrease the potential for mortality to people. There are emergency actions people and companies can and do take in those circumstances. Again, we really plan and hope to avoid that.
But I imagine that if the region doesn't act and act more swiftly, that this idea of a once every 10 years event becomes a once every 5 years or every year.
Yes.
So let's start to think about what solutions might look like and what's in the realm of possible short-term and again, longer-term. One thing that really jumped out at me in the report is that there is a recommendation, if I read it correctly, that the region not rule out and in fact should rule in continuing to use natural gas power for the foreseeable future, which is not carbon neutral, doesn't help the state meet its future goals. But what's the message again to policymakers on that front?
Yeah, the message is that we need to do what's practical and what's realistic. So what's practical and realistic over the next 5 to 10 to 15 years is develop as much as we can of the technologies that are mature and are ready to be developed. That's wind, solar, it's batteries, it's geothermal to the extent that those resources are available. And that's nuclear. I wouldn't put nuclear really in that category. We've only had one large nuclear plant energized in the United States in the last 20 years.
So that's in a different basket. The other forms of electricity, the wind, solar, geothermal, you put that in the kind of the realm of
Mature commercial
Mature
technologies.
commercial technology. Okay,
Yes.
so continue pushing in that direction,
Yes.
but
Demand side solutions as well, as I talked about. But then you also need to have enough power during those low water conditions, that extended cold snap that might last for several days. You'll be very happy that you have a natural gas plant during that circumstance that you can turn on, rather than having to endure a rotating blackout type of an event. So to the
so
extent
can
that
you
those
have
are-
natural gas on standby? Will somebody actually operate a power plant that isn't used all the time, that's just there for emergency purposes? Is there kind of an economic, scale that works there?
Yes, absolutely. They're called peaker plants, and there's a whole fleet of peaker plants everywhere in the country. That's kind of how they operate. They're typically relatively inefficient, and so they have a high operating cost. So they're the last plants that you turn on. So everything else that's cheaper goes before that. But as the demand rises and it goes up and up and up, you keep turning on plants that are less and less efficient and more costly to operate until you get to the last ones, and those are the ones that you operate the least.
So what is our current natural gas power plant footprint in this region?
It's actually relatively small in this region because, again, this goes back to the hydro asset that's kind of at the base of our power system. So everywhere else, there's a whole fleet of natural gas peakers that wait around for most of the year and are turned on when it gets very hot or very cold. In the Northwest, for a long time, that same service was provided by the hydro system because you have these very large dams with some reservoir storage behind them. They all have a lot of powerhouses that they don't use most of the time, but when it gets really cold, that's when you run a lot of water through the powerhouses and you can create a lot of power for very short periods of time. So we've been fortunate not to have to build a lot of gas plants in our region because we have these hydropower projects.
So the rub here in this report is this region is trying to decarbonize. We don't have the standby natural gas plants that other regions do, which maybe if we did, we would just phase them out over a longer period of time than perhaps planned. But it sounds like what we might have to do is actually build some of those plants, which seems to be taking us in the opposite direction of the decarbonization goals.
Yeah, and I can see why people might have that impression just from that whole notion. Why are we building gas plants if we're trying to get off of gas? And I think the answer to that really is there's a difference between building the plants and running the plants. So building them so that they're available when we need them ensures that we have reliable power. And by the way, these peaker plants, combustion turbine plants, are the lowest cost form of peaking capacity. So that's the least capital intensive solution that we have to this problem. But then once the plants are in the ground, you try to run them as little as you can. And you do that by having other sources of energy available, wind and solar and hydro and any nuclear, geothermal. All of those things are lower cost than natural gas to operate. So they'll all be forced. They'll all be ahead of natural gas in the sort of supply stack. And so that's how you can both have the reliable power, build new gas plants, but then run them less and less over time as you add more and more clean resources.
Before we go to break, do you have a sense, and I realize this wasn't the mandate of your study, but do you have a sense of whether current policy in states like Washington and Oregon would allow for us to build some peaker plants that are fired by natural gas, or would that require a change in policy? Would lawmakers have to come in and pass a law? Do you have a sense of that?
My understanding is that in Oregon, that's not allowed. So Oregon has banned the construction of new natural gas plants larger than 25 megawatts, so utility scale plants. You might still be able to build some smaller ones behind the meter at a large data center, for example. Washington, I don't think, has banned gas-fired power plants, and so I think it is possible. That.
And would your recommendation be whether you, regardless of people's politics about decarbonization, how quickly we do that, would your recommendation be to the administrations and the legislatures in both states that they move quickly to start to build that capacity, even though the Sierra Club and others will undoubtedly oppose it vociferously?
Yeah, our recommendation is that some amount of new natural gas be part of the long-term portfolio for the region. And again, and maybe we'll get to this after the break, but we modeled portfolios that achieve the region's long-term carbon goals, and we found new natural gas capacity as part of those least cost portfolios that meet carbon goals.
Okay, we'll stop there. We'll take a break. We'll continue the conversation with Arne Olson of Energy and Environmental Economics, the consulting firm that's just produced the final stage of this report to utilities. We'll be back after this.
You're crazy if you go into the real estate market or the building market because you're getting hit by everything. It's almost like running it in a track meet when you're doing hurdles. Okay, I crossed one hurdle, here's another one, and all of those hurdles add cost.
We have to get the land use process sped up, which means permitting times, permitting fees, land development processes, all of those keep us from building housing faster.
Welcome back to Inside Olympia. Joining me once again is Arne Olson, senior partner at the consulting firm Energy and Environmental Economics. And I do want to pick up on kind of where we left off, which is this idea that, or it begs the question, can we have our cake and eat it too? Can we increase energy supplies, perhaps have these natural gas-fired peaker plants sort of on standby, and still meet our decarbonization goals?
Yeah, and our study says that the answer to that is yes. So we explored.
Does it push off the deadlines? And I think we're talking 2045 here in Washington State. Would we have to push that off some number of years, or can we meet the goals within the deadlines that the states have set?
There's a lot of things that have to happen between now and 2045, but our study models portfolios that do achieve those goals. Now they're very challenging to make happen. There's a lot of construction. The level of construction we talked about before the break has to accelerate beyond 2035 and 2045 to meet the new electric demand and to continue to reduce the amount of carbon in the power system. But I think yes is the general answer. Yes, that's doable, and the timeline, I think we just have to wait and see.
I was struck that in the report that you talk about the idea that getting to 95, 96% of carbon neutral or zero carbon electricity in this region is doable. It's the next 4 to 5% or the last 4 to 5% that could be very hard or very expensive to reach. But I was in some respects surprised that you can get that far. But then what is it about the last few percentage points that make it so difficult?
Yeah, so the reason why you can get that far is because the resources that wind and solar are displacing are also expensive. So natural gas-fired power plants have also tripled in price over the last 5 years, on par with what has happened to wind and solar prices. Of course, natural gas fuel is uncertain. It varies when there's a war. Prices tend to go up. But yeah, the resources that wind and solar displace are also relatively expensive. If you can expand the region in which we develop these projects out to include Idaho and Montana and Wyoming and Utah, where there's better wind and maybe better solar as well, then we can bring a diverse array of resources from a broad geographic area to bear. So yeah, our modeling suggests that achieving very deep levels of carbon reductions is not very much more expensive than whatever the lowest cost thing would have been that you would develop. Now, that's up to 90, something percent. We focus on the 96% scenario in our study because that's where the cost curve kind of starts to bend up. The reason why it's hard to go past that is just because of the limitations of these mature technologies. So wind resources only produce energy when the wind is blowing, and solar only produces energy, obviously, when the sun is shining. And the type of storage technologies that we have commercially available today are 4-hour lithium-ion batteries. Maybe these could be 8-hour, maybe they could be 12-hour, but certainly a meaningful limit on the duration of its ability to store electric energy.
You can't store weeks of wind power or solar power that's stored up.
Exactly.
And then use it when it's needed. It's pretty short-term storage right now.
Exactly. So there are periods of time when you just don't have those resources available. And again, in the Northwest, it would typically happen during a low water year as well. So you need something else that you can turn on during those periods. And there just isn't a substitute that's commercially available today at scale to combusting fuel to make power during those periods. And so that's the reason why we continue to need natural gas, and we will continue to need natural gas generation until there's a substitute for it that can perform the service that it performs for the grid today.
So again, given that substitute is not identified yet and not available, based on the modeling you all have done, does it look like the states can meet their 2040 or 2045 decarbonization goals while still using some natural gas standby power?
Yeah, and so we didn't try to model the letter of the laws in Washington, Oregon in our study. We were looking at regionally what's the best way to reduce carbon emissions. And so I don't know if the Oregon law, for example, is it absolute zero carbon? We can never emit a single ton of carbon ever, or is it more of a net zero where there's some gas that continues to be allowed, and they can import clean power during other periods, so it nets out over the course of a year, and that would make a big difference in terms of whether the sort of the letter of the law is achievable. I think the high level conclusion again is very deep levels of carbon reductions are feasible at a rate that's affordable, and maintaining a reliable power system. Going beyond that to get to absolute zero would really require new technologies to make that feasible.
I do want to just loop back to the energy permitting part of the conversation. I'm looking at a news release from the National Governors Association. Bipartisan group of governors is urging federal action to streamline approval for energy infrastructure. This is a bipartisan issue. It's a issue across the states. It goes beyond just electricity to talk about generally energy more broadly, but there seems to be a growing acknowledgement that we don't have the energy resources we need to power the future. And it's not just our Northwest region, although we have unique challenges and maybe unique opportunities as well. I want to bring back the concept of our hydropower system, which has been such a workhorse and so reliable. But there are those who want to pull the dams out to save the salmon. We hear a lot about the upper Snake River dams. If we started heading in the direction of reducing our hydropower by removing dams, what would the implications be then to these scenarios that you guys have just identified?
Yeah, so we've already identified a significant amount of power that needs to be constructed, excuse me, and a challenge with the reliable power that's needed again during those periods of extended cold snaps. The dams do, even during low water condition, provide important amounts of power during those extended cold weather events. So reducing our existing resources would just make that challenge harder. And we've done a study for the Bonneville Power Administration on what it would take to replace the energy services of the 4 lower Snake dams. And it's very costly, it's very difficult.
What is let's talk about BPA. What is it capable of modernizing and speeding? One of the issues seems to be plugging in new sources of power to their infrastructure. And I think it's also an argument for doing systems that don't need to be plugged in. In fact, there was some talk of the state setting up its own, the state of Washington setting up its own sort of energy infrastructure system. But how are you thinking about BPA's ability to address these future needs and to modernize?
Yeah, so the issue there's, I guess, 2 issues that Bonneville needs to address and is working on. So one of them is what's called the interconnection queue. So these are the list of all of the resources that are would like to connect to their system so that they can deliver energy to a buyer. And what we're seeing everywhere in the country is that there's just a huge amount of interest in developing new power plants, such that the queues have gotten extremely long. There's enough energy to power all of California at least 2 times over, waiting in the California ISO queue to interconnect. So just getting all of the studies done on all of these resources is just a huge challenge, especially for a federal agency that, again, given what we've seen from the federal government, has had a hard time retaining staff, much less, it really needs to grow its staff. And it's only in the last 6 months that it's had the clearance from DOE to do that. So it's been challenged for a variety of reasons. The second challenge is then identifying and building the transmission lines that are needed to deliver that power to where it's being consumed. And here, Bonneville has played a really important role throughout its history of operating the high voltage power system and building it and constructing it for our region, truly to the benefit of everyone. But when Bonneville wants to build something, and then its capital plans get counted against the federal budget. So they have to then go and find other savings somewhere in the federal government and in the federal budget so that Bonneville can get the clearance to spend this money on building new assets in the Northwest. And so for a long time, that's been a very difficult challenge that they've had to navigate in Washington, I think has been a barrier for them.
And there's probably no real solution on the horizon for that problem?
Not that I'm aware of.
So is that an argument for decoupling to some extent from the Bonneville Power Administration's transmission lines and grid and doing something more independent or more state-specific?
I mean, Bonneville is going to continue to play an important role. Let's be clear about that. They're the largest transmission provider in the region, but we absolutely need to be looking at a lot of different creative ways to get the infrastructure developed. And there are now a number of private companies out there that are going around the country looking for interesting and good projects that perhaps might have been overlooked by a traditional utility. So there is an active industry out there that are bringing forward potential solutions. We're seeing states, not just Washington, but other states have done this as well, create transmission authorities that are intended to help just speed the process of identifying, permitting, siting, and constructing the power lines that we'll need.
If money is the issue and we have enjoyed relatively low energy rates, electricity rates in this region because of hydropower, we think of it as clean and cheap, and certainly as compared to other parts of the country where people pay much more for their electricity bill, if part of the issue is that Bonneville doesn't have the funding to build the extra capacity and transmission, and nonetheless we have to build more, what is the potential impact to ratepayers? Should they expect to pay more? Should they be? I mean, we underinvest in infrastructure in this country already. What's the bottom line for the ratepayers?
And we do provide estimates of average electricity rates over time in our study, and I'm sorry to say that they're going up. And they're going up really regardless of what the power supply is that is selected by our computer models. But even the lowest cost set of resources require fairly significant rate increases over the next 20 years. And that's really just because the cost of new stuff is much more expensive now than relative to the cost of what we already are paying for that's embedded in the existing power system.
Do ratepayers have to cover the 100% of the cost to do these upgrades and expansions of resources?
Yes.
It's ultimately falls to the ratepayers.
Ultimately, it falls to the ratepayers, yeah. I mean,
and what are we talking about? Can you put some numbers to it?
Oh, I think our projection was that power rates would increase by 50% over a 20-year period.
50% over
That's
a 20-year period?
over a 20-year period, yes.
Wow. So that's a bit of a wake-up call for people who've been used to. And then as more people are buying electric cars and sort of electrifying their lives, what seemed like maybe an economic advantage, because I'm paying for electricity to charge my car, not gasoline to fuel it, maybe some of those incentives start to go away.
I'll say that even at the levels that we're modeling, the Northwest continues to be one of the lower cost regions in the country, so it still doesn't get anywhere near the levels that we see in the Northeast or in California, for example. Certainly it makes electrifying more difficult, but then on the other hand, we've seen what's happened to gasoline prices in the last few months, and that can happen in an instant, and we see natural gas prices growing over time as well.
Do you know, as your modeling shown, if we do the 50% increases, I mean, does that bias the capacity that we need?
Yes, the modeling shows that's the cost of buying the capacity that we need, again, to meet our clean energy and our reliability goals.
I do want to come back to nuclear. Where does that, you've said I can understand as somebody who's in the business of modeling the future, if you haven't seen a lot of success or a lot of examples, you don't want to put too many eggs in that basket. But we are hearing more and more in this state, at least, and among legislators, some interest on a bipartisan level about modular nuclear energy. I know that Bill Gates has gotten involved in this. I think they're doing something in Wyoming, a bigger project there. What do you think is the future with respect to nuclear and maybe other sources that are sort of in that vein?
Yeah, there are a number of different candidate resources that could help fill that gap to meet that last 4 to 5% of carbon reductions. And nuclear is certainly one of them.
So you would put you would see that as a way to get to the 100% carbon reduction as opposed to fill the gaps that were needed just to supply our energy demands?
I mean,
or both?
Yeah, nuclear would do both because it can produce power around the clock, even during a cold snap, et cetera. Developing it to the scale that's needed to fill the gap that we see in this region would take a long time, even if it were a mature technology, just to get the number of plants that would be needed to get those permitted and sited and constructed and energized, et cetera. But it's a very exciting time for nuclear. We haven't really, our nuclear industry kind of died after the 1980s. And the last power plant in Georgia, Plant Vogtle, really limped to the finish line and was way over budget. So we just almost didn't have a nuclear industry. But today there's just a huge amount of interest. And I'd say we're at the sort of looking at a bunch of different technology stages. There's dozens of different designs out there for small modular reactors. There are still people that are interested in bringing back the light water reactors, of which we have 100,000 megawatts in this country. So those are still live, and lots of other new technologies out there, so it's very exciting. But when we don't have them in the ground today, we can't expect them to be available in 10 years. Maybe in 15 years, and probably in 20 years, we'll be able to get some.
And the solar and winds, how much can we really bank on that, given the limitations you talked about earlier, given our geography in this region, and the fact that you can't store that energy for very long? And I know that critics have said, this is not a one-for-one replacement for other more reliable sources, like coal, like natural gas, like hydro. So how should we be thinking about these renewable energy sources as the way that we're going to power our future?
Yeah. So again, as we're showing in our study, if you're planning to get a lot of your energy from wind and solar, that's why you need to keep that backbone of natural gas power on the system so that they're available when the wind and solar isn't. You have to understand the limitations of the resources that you're developing. That being said, those are very mature technologies. They can come online in many cases faster than a natural gas plant. Are a lot of places that you can put solar and have a pretty good resource. It's not, we're not the Mojave Desert here, even in eastern Washington. But how much of that you can build is really more of a social license question. Is how many acres do we want to devote to this sort of industrial energy farming, and where do we think are acceptable places to put those resources? And here again, other regions have done a lot of sort of top-down studies, state-level studies to identify lands that are good candidates. Maybe they're degraded farmland in California with saline soils from over-irrigation for many years. They're places that are near the transmission system. I don't think we've done a lot of that sort of foundational work in the Northwest of identifying where are the best places for us to put those resources.
And so where does this leave us? If we've got wind and solar as sort of the easy options, but they're not really that easy. We've got the natural gas backup potential if policymakers want to go in that direction. Nuclear may be out in the future. What else holds promise? Because I'm not seeing a simple solution here.
No, there's definitely no simple solution. The other solutions that are out there are things like carbon capture. So taking our existing or perhaps new natural gas plants and capturing the carbon dioxide from them and then injecting that underground. The geology in eastern Washington is very favorable to that. It reacts with the basalt and turns into limestone very quickly, so it really solves any issues with release of the carbon dioxide over time. There's a lot going on in the geothermal industry, different ways to find sources of heat underground and different ways to enhance the heat that comes out so it's hotter and more useful to make power. That's another one. There was some excitement about hydrogen a couple of years ago. That seems to have subsided a little bit with the change in federal administration. There are just a whole variety of different technologies out there to store electric energy over time. There's an iron-air battery that can store power up to 100 hours. There are different types of thermal batteries. So there's a lot of entrepreneurial energy and money going into solutions that we hope will pay off in the 15 to 20-year time frame. In the near term, it really just comes back to wind, solar, batteries, demand-side resources, and natural gas as much as we can.
What about offshore wind? It's kind of big on the East Coast.
It's Europe has had good success with offshore wind in the North Sea, where they have a low seabed, shallow fixed platform, and there was a lot of interest in the Northeast U.S. about that resource as well, and there are some projects under construction in New York and in Massachusetts. There's one operating in Massachusetts.
Although the president doesn't like it.
The president certainly does not like it, and so that's a challenge.
And there's opposition here. I mean, and the coastal tribes have been concerned about it. But would you say it's something that needs to be revisited here?
It certainly should be on the table. It should be looked at. Now, we don't have that shallow continental shelf in the Pacific, so this is
You'd be going deep.
This is floating offshore wind
it's floating. Okay.
platforms that are really based on an oil platform as kind of a model for what the platform looks like, and that's no one's really done that at scale anywhere yet, but there's a lot of interest in it for sure.
What about energy savings, efficiency, and conservation? Can't that get us some part of the way?
I mean, that needs to be first. That's the most important thing that we can do is weatherize our homes, ensure that we buy efficient appliances and a variety of those things, and charge our electric vehicles at the right times, and engage with smart thermostats and other programs to reduce load, especially during the peak periods. That is all critically important. There's just a limit to how much of that we'll practically be able to do.
What about a moratorium on data centers? I mean, if they're going to be a big driver of energy use in the future, should the states be saying, we're not building any more of these things, at least until we have the supply? Or conversely, can they pay for the extra supply and then turn things off when we have a shortage?
Yeah, there's a lot of interest also in, can we connect data centers flexibly? And what we've typically seen flexible interconnection mean is that they build resources behind the meter, and when they turn off from the grid, that means that they turn on their generation that's behind the meter. And typically, today at least, that's fossil generation. That's a natural gas plant, or even worse, maybe even a diesel plant that they would rely on. So that really doesn't, if that's the solution, flexible data centers doesn't really change the nature of the solution. It just moves it to the other side of the electric meter.
Is it an argument to just, the state of Maine just did a ban on new data centers. Is that something policymakers should be thinking seriously about, given the projections here?
That really is a public policy question about what's the economic benefit of having this industry located in our state relative to these societal costs that are real. There's land use, there's water use, there's power consumption, et cetera. But there's also a loss in economic activity. And in a state like Washington, which relies on firms like Microsoft and Amazon and Meta for a lot of our tax revenue and a lot of our economic base, I would have to look very closely at whether I really wanted to put up a stop sign for those firms to develop these projects in our region.
How much of the growth in load demand in the future would you attribute to AI and data centers?
It's really hard to put a number on that right now. The highest scenarios are that we would have to double the size of the power system. We're assuming something much less, something like 5 to 10% of electric demand over time becomes data center driven, but it certainly could be higher than that.
The phase out of coal, should that be revisited? Should we slow the roll and maybe continue to tap into those coal? I guess the coal strip plants are transitioning, but is there any reason to say, well, you've mentioned natural gas, but where does coal fit into this?
To me, going backwards on coal retirements is kind of an admission that we failed, and I hope that we don't get there. There is a viable plan to replace those coal resources with, again, this mix of gas, wind, solar, and batteries, and I hope that we get to a place where we don't have to do that. But Pacific Corp is one of the utilities that serves customers in Washington and Oregon and other western states, is slowing down the retirement of its coal plants, so that is happening.
I'm going to stop you there. You've given us a lot to think about. I think you've given policymakers a lot to think about, too. Arne Olson from the E3 consulting firm, thank you for coming in and laying out your findings of this report. Very interesting, perhaps concerning as well. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for watching Inside Olympia. We'll see you again next week.